Alright, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about how to choose studio monitor speakers. No matter where you go, any forum you visit, there will always be heated, passionate debates on this topic. Some people will recommend certain brands and bash others, while on the other side, you'll get a wave of criticism coming your way. There are people who have been mixing for 15 to 20 years, and they'll say, this is garbage, but this one works. So, I'll try to shed some light on this issue so that those who aren't too familiar with the topic can figure out what to buy. Here's the thing. Speakers aren't the only factor that determines proper monitoring, meaning accurate control, which is what we're all aiming for. It's actually a combination of the room, the speakers, and also something called individual hearing. Let's break down which of these is more complicated, because a lot of people tend to just ignore the individual hearing part and focus only on the room and the speakers. But the thing is, sound appears somewhere, and then it hits your eardrum. The eardrum vibrates and transmits this vibration to the auditory ossicles. In turn, they pass the vibration on to the cochlea of the inner ear. And then the fluid inside the cochlea starts to shift a bit, which sets the hair cells in motion. It all sounds pretty complicated. And then, on top of that, these hair cells start generating electrical signals. This electrical signal reaches the temporal lobes of the brain, and that's where the conversion of these waves happens into what we actually hear. Our brain starts to perceive this as sound. You get it, right? This system is way more complex than any monitor speakers, fancy acoustic rooms, or all of that combined. I mean, it's so individual that if you and I both sat in front of the same speakers, for example, we would end up mixing two completely different tracks, even if we used the exact same mixing techniques and had the same experience. Maybe you perceive the high frequencies as brighter, while I, for example, hear the highs as more muted. That's it, at this point we're already diverging. For example, you might be more aware of a honk around 200 Hz, while I notice it less. So here too, we differ. No matter what, even in the same room, we'll end up with different mixes. I'd add one more thing to this system, which makes it even more complicated. That's habit. Habit when it comes to certain mixes, habit with certain references, habit with mixing. In other words, a kind of frequency response curve that we generally listen to. Because if you're working within the same genre, more or less, you also develop a habit for that, for a certain frequency response. If you're mixing jazz, for example, having more subdued highs is normal for you. If you're mixing some kind of retro music, having more subdued highs is also your norm. But if you're mixing something wild like dubstep or drum and bass, you're somewhere in the area of extremes, and for your ears, having those high frequencies is the norm. So, what am I getting at with all this? The point is, from the perspective of sound engineering, these things aren't really about being an audiophile. If we're talking about people who buy themselves some kind of gold-plated cables or special wooden stands, basically, those who are really obsessed with audio gear, honestly, we don't really care how something sounds to them. What matters to us is that, in the end, we get a reference that translates well. And even if we mixed a track using the speaker from a phone like this, and it actually sounds good, then that's it. We'll just stick with this phone and keep mixing on it. Yeah, it might be uncomfortable, but what can you do if we can't get a good mix on barefoots that cost $1 million, but somehow, on this crappy little speaker, we managed to pull it off? That's it. As sound engineers, we just have to sit down and mix on whatever we have. Basically, because for us, the main thing is the end result. For some audiophile, it's all about warmth or whatever else, like those who listen to vinyl. But, as they say, an audiophile is no brother to a sound engineer, and we have different tasks. If our combination of room, our hearing, the number, I don't know, the quality or size of our auditory ossicles, some fluid in the inner ear where the cochlea is, if all that isn't the same for everyone, what can you do? We all perceive music differently. So, one person will mix well on one setup, and I'll do it on another. So, based on all this, how should we go about choosing speakers? I had an interesting experience. When I was just starting to mix, learning, I was mixing on some cheap earbuds that cost about 1,000 rubles. Then I bought myself some monitors, but they were budget ones. A year or two went by, and I listened to my old mixes on those monitors. the ones I had mixed on those cheap earbuds, basically when I was just a kid, you could say. And I realized that back then, I was actually making better mixes than I was on the monitors. And we need to choose in a more scientific way. So, in this case, choosing speakers is more of an empirical process. That is, not even based on reviews or how they sound. Like, some people say, I like these speakers, someone bought them. And on the RM Media forum, someone writes, I like these speakers, they handle transients really well. Or, the highs come through perfectly for me. But maybe, for the sake of mixed translation, you don't actually need those highs to come through, meaning, in the end result. Maybe the combination of your hearing in some muddy, crappy highs ends up giving you a mix that translates well, that sounds good on all headphones, speakers, and so on. Because our main goal, basically, is to have a quality mix on all, more or less, devices. In other words, we need adaptability. So, that's something to think about. Of course, it's great when we can hear all the space in these speakers. When the highs come through, the lows are clear. It's wonderful, right? But if the final result with all of that sounds worse than on some device that costs 1,000 rubles, which, honestly, is pretty unlikely, then you should be mixing on that 1,000-ruble device. So, what do we do? What kind of shift do we need to make here to figure things out the right way? If your budget is up to $2,000, that's one approach. If your budget is over $2,000, you're probably already a pretty seasoned producer or sound engineer, so you should have a different approach. Let's start with the first one. Your budget is under $2,000, and most likely, you're still a beginner, not a very experienced sound engineer yet. Chances are, you have some tracks, some reference songs that you know really well. Mostly, these are your own tracks. So, what do? Most likely, you have a track somewhere that you once mixed for someone, already delivered, and that's it. The project is closed for you. But then you go out for a walk in the park or something, and suddenly you hear a flaw in that track. Like, for example, you notice the balance is off when listening on another device, or in the car you realize you never managed to get rid of that hum. It's still there, even though on your monitors, maybe some budget ones, everything seemed fine. Then you go to a big sound system, turn it up, and hear that the low end is muddy, for example. So, you already know all these quirks in this track, but they don't show up on your monitors. They only come out on other equipment. You take this track, fully aware of its issues, and play it on some speakers. If any of those speakers clearly reveal all these flaws, like, here's that muddy bass you noticed on the big system, or maybe there was some dirty reverb, tails overlapping each other, well, here you go, you can hear those overlapping tails perfectly. So, if the speakers reveal all of that, then those are your speakers. And it really doesn't matter what brand they are, or where exactly the bass reflex port is, plus or minus, because sometimes it just comes down to what a person is used to mixing on. In a certain genre, especially if he's focused, he can, with some hassle of course, manage to mix even on total junk, like when the bass reflex port is on the back of the speaker and the speaker is pressed right up against the wall. So, everything's fine, because the guy is used to it. He's somehow adapted to the frequency response of the speakers and the room. His ear shape works for him. His hair cells are doing their job just right, and that's not something we can get into. But let's imagine that in your head, several different frequency responses are overlapping. There's the frequency response of the room, the frequency response of the speakers, and your own frequency response. This whole combination, how the sound travels through your ear and reaches the temporal lobes of your brain. And when all of these overlap, they end up creating a kind of properly balanced, overall frequency response. And so, this kind of combination works for that person. They don't need to change the room or anything else. Plus, they have their own habits, and they always listen to the same genre, and don't care about anything else. In that case, you just look at the end result. The ideal scenario is like this. Here's another recommendation. Especially if you're after some expensive equipment and want to really test it out, take a mix that you're not familiar with, so you don't already know its flaws in advance. Just straightforwardly mix on it. That is, you can call up several studios that have those monitor speakers, book a session, and say, "Hey guys, I want to mix a track on your equipment." You come in and do the mix. Then you take a break, and already with such fresh ears, you go for a walk in the park with headphones and check the mix on different equipment, in the car, and so on. If everything sounds more or less okay, considering that you're not used to their room and not even used to their monitors, because getting used to them is a big factor, then those are your speakers. If you end up with a worse result than on your current speakers, for example, more budget ones, then those aren't your speakers. That's the logic. That's it. We have 3 options. So, 2 of these options, if you're not choosing budget speakers, involve going to studios that have speakers of that class and doing a mix there. It's not that expensive. You pay, 1,000 rubles an hour, but you could end up saving yourself 300,000 or 400,000 rubles, or even more. Go to 5 different studios with different speakers. Okay, you'll spend about 10,000, but you'll make the right choice for yourself. And that's it. So that's one option. So, who recommends what? In other words, whose speakers are better? Some people praise Genelec, others praise Yamaha, or Neumann, and so on. But everyone is wired differently. It's not the same as you. Maybe your highs are too pronounced, so you actually need to pick speakers that sound duller to compensate. So really, the only way is trial and error. And I think a lot of people would probably agree with me on this point. A lot of people have experienced this. You mix on something high-end, then you listen to your old tracks and realize that, even though you used just some basic earbuds, it somehow didn't sound terrible. Maybe it sounded a bit worse, but not 1,000 times worse. Not enough to justify the cost of all that monitoring gear. I'm not trying to convince you to go for budget options, not at all. Objectively speaking, of course, the more parameters your system covers, the better. But there are a lot of little nuances here, like when you realize that maybe you don't even need the highs, or you don't need certain frequencies to be so clear to you. Sometimes, for some reason, you don't need to get too deep into the topic of clear highs, you just do it. Or, for example, you might be working with well-defined transients or fast monitors that really show the dynamics well, but for some reason, when you use them, you end up getting the dynamics wrong. Maybe your hearing is different, you perceive things differently than others, or there's a certain parameter you just can't get right. On the contrary, maybe you actually need something worse, for example. That's just how it is. That's what works for you, and that's it. So the only option is to go out, check, rent studios, and see for yourself. If you live in a small town, just work with whatever is available in your city. Narrow your choices in that direction, because that's your only real empirical way forward. Or go to a bigger city where they have those kinds of monitors. In principle, that will pay off too, considering the price of monitors and the current exchange rate of our, let's say, dot-protected ruble. So, I think my thoughts are clear to you. I've given you a straightforward plan of what you definitely shouldn't do, like reading reviews or watching what and how. That's all complete nonsense when it comes to serious things like monitoring. All the best, dear friends. Give this video a like.